We're up to Colorado in the low points playlist, where I'm avoiding calling it the worst of, but it kind of sort of really is. And of course, the fun stuff with the goalie names at the end, because why not? Now, with Colorado, you have to factor in Quebec. Now, the Quebec Nordiques had their struggles in the late 80s, which Quebec fans supported them through, and they rewarded them in the mid 90s by leaving. And that's really what happened there. And those late 80s, early 90s rough spots there, 5 years out of the playoffs from 1988 to 1992. And I guess one thing I'm wondering too is, so I have the lost asset part, and I kept thinking, so Lindros is the biggest name player that I can think of that's ever been drafted that didn't play for the team that drafted him. And that's a whole list for a whole other time. But is it a lost asset when you pick up Forsberg and a whole bunch of other items that end up getting you to a Stanley Cup? I would argue no. Now, Marcel Aubé, and there's been plenty of talk since that Lindros video about how Aubé's kind of a terrible person, and by all accounts, that would seem to be the case, and would seem to have been the case right up until very recently he lost a job he had due to his saying a lot of off-color things he shouldn't be saying. And at the time that Quebec moves to Colorado, that is a low point for the Quebec franchise that turns into a pretty high point for the Colorado franchise. So their longest drought as an organization between Quebec and Colorado is that 88 through 92. But as a Colorado fan, your lowest point likely was a few years ago when the team was bad and looked awful and they couldn't trade Duchesne, and McKinnon wasn't quite clicking at the NHL level, and things were just kind of a mess. And then all of a sudden McKinnon clicks, the Duchesne trade was fantastic, and Colorado's one of the best young teams in the league. So things really changed quickly for Colorado. So even though they had some years that were outside the playoffs, and they had one really miserable year in there as well, I would still say that the worst drought was Quebec's, because Quebec's was awful. Now, most losses, and this again is both Quebec and Colorado, of Varlamov, 156 losses in the net for Colorado. They've gone through goaltenders with some regularity, so it doesn't surprise me Varlamov's necessarily highest in the losses category. Lost asset, you can pick him. I think Marty Jelena, who they waived, right? They put him on waivers, and Vancouver went, thanks, and took him, because that's what you do. And Jelena went on to enjoy a pretty solid career after leaving Quebec. Johnny Boychuk I have up there as a lost asset, and he played a few games in Colorado, and then he ends up in Boston, and he's had an excellent career. So it's hard to come up with anybody that I can look at and say, gee, this guy was really great when he was young, and they lost out on him. And that's why Lindros for me is up there with a question mark, because it's the most obvious one. And yet, again, they end up with Forsberg, so they came out of it pretty well. I don't think, at the end of the day, Nordiques fans should be too angry about how that turned out. Short-term coaches, Maurice Filion, 1981, only coached 6 games, so that's your interim. 1-3-2 record. Andre Savard in 1988 only spent 24 games behind the bench, 10-13-1, which, considering it's 1988 when they were going into that really bad stretch, that record's not bad. It's not bad, comparatively speaking, to some of the other records put up by that team in and around those years. Not in the Hall of Fame. So again, it's your top scorers among the organization, your number one guy in wins, who is retired and not in the Hall of Fame. Milan Hajduk, Colorado Avalanche. Very fascinating one there, in that I remember him being a big deal at the Olympics, and then all of a sudden he's in Colorado. If he had played his entire career in the NHL, who knows? Hajduk was a guy who kind of came out of nowhere, and he was a pretty darn good player as well. And it's kind of easy to forget that. And yes, I probably should do a Milan Hajduk video, just because Hajduk is fun to say. And the guy turned out to be pretty good. Dan Bouchard is the all-time wins leader for the franchise that's not in the Hall of Fame. Again, amongst retired goaltenders. Bouchard's not a Hall of Fame level goaltender, but he was one of my favorite goaltenders when I was a little kid. So year 1, and again I did year 1 and year 11 for both Quebec and for Colorado. Year 1 for Quebec, 25, 44, and 11 for 61 points. Again, the NHL really beat up on the WHA teams when they came in. Year 11, they were worse. 89-90, 12, 61, and 7, 31 points. That's your downbeat for this organization overall. that 12-win season was miserable. So as bad as Colorado was a few years ago, that season's worse. Easily worse. It was awful, and that's when the Stastnys are gone. Like it just went from they were contenders middle of the 80s to yeah, now they're garbage by 90. Now their first year in Colorado, 47, 25, and 10 for 104 points, and they won the Stanley Cup. Not too bad. They won the Stanley Cup again in 2001. By 06-07, they'd started to kind of fall off. 44, 31, and 7 for 95 points. They were good for a long time in Colorado. So again, when I'm trying to put together this downbeats kind of video, it is worthy of note. Colorado has not had the kind of suffering that Quebec had. And I don't think there's very many organizations that have. Just for how much suffering there was in such a short period of time that the Nordiques were in the NHL. Lowest points percentage against Washington, a 443 percentage. And before Leafs fans jump in and go, we've had more misery. Just imagine if the Toronto Maple Leafs moved and won the Stanley Cup the year after they moved. Yeah. Yeah. So 443 winning percentage against the Washington Capitals. Of course, this includes the Quebec Nordiques. Goals for per game. Their lowest number is against the Anaheim Ducks. So again, a 90s expansion team. 2.65 goals for per game. Goals against per game. The most is against Boston, 3.74. I remember Boston feasting on the Nordiques. I do recall that when Quebec was on the schedule, you could kind of mark a W there at times. But of course, everybody did. That's how you end up 12, 61, and 7. Lowest points per game. And again, this has to be a player that's played 100 or more games for either Colorado or for Quebec. Scott Parker for the Abs, .068. Ossi Vananen, .086. Great name. Not a guy who scored a ton of points. Marc-Andre Clichet, .093. And then Jeff Odgers, .102 points per game. So Quebec Nordiques, their lowest was Tony Twist, .046. Not really known as a point producer, Mr. Twist. Gord Donnelly, .103. Randy Velishek, .145. And Stephen Finn, .169. So you can notice the difference in scoring between the Nordiques era and what Colorado's played through mostly. Lowest save percentage, minimum of 50 games played, 2 from each organization, from the Colorado Avalanche, and again, that minimum of 50 games played. Peter Budaj, 902, and Jose Theodore also has a 902 save percentage. So that's not bad. Goaltending's been pretty solid for Quebec all the way through, apparently. On the Quebec side of things, for Colorado, 902. For Quebec, Gosselin, Mario Gosselin, .871, and Michel Dion, 8.876. Michel Dion, as I remember too, he played on a lot of bad teams, and that had to be frustrating. It has to be frustrating when you're a good goaltender on a bad team. Now, goalie with the best name for Colorado, and I really wish he'd made it. I really wish that had become an NHL-level goaltending name. Sami Eidakallio. Sami Eidakallio was a name that I only discovered because of EA Sports NHL games. I'm like, that's a great name. So I would pick him up. I mean, all right, I'm picking him up. He's going to be my third-string goaltender, and every now and then he'd turn into a half-decent backup. But, of course, at the NHL level, it just never happened. Every now and then I'd mess around and make his potential elite level, like, so he would turn into this explosive great, because I love the name. And, of course, for Quebec, it has to be Ron Tugnut. I thought, well, Mario Burnett is kind of a fun name to say. Nah. I could say John Tanner because it's a very common-sounding name, and that would be odd for me to throw in there. Just the fact that they had so many goaltenders during that awful season, I could throw them all up there and say, all these guys were goaltenders that one year. But I went with Ron Tugnut because, yeah, part of the reason that I would have cheered for Tugnut may very well have been his last name. Although, he was a pretty solid goaltender, again, on some pretty bad teams. So, in terms of varying degrees, I would say, again, that the pain was worse for Quebec than it's been for Colorado. But I'm not going to try to discount what Colorado went through either. They've had a couple of stretches where they've gone 3 years out of the playoffs. And they've had some mediocrity of their own that they've dealt with. Like right now, I look at them as a contending team. I look at them as a team that could win a Stanley Cup with their current makeup. But they went through a lot of suffering to get there. Not Quebec level, but they went through a lot of suffering to get there. So yeah, and in terms of my jersey choice for today, I went with this one. I know I don't wear this one a lot. It's actually it's a McKinnon that I got through Full Moon Jerseys a couple years ago. Colorado's another team that they don't really have an ugly jersey. Not really. And if you're gonna say this year's stadium jersey, I'm gonna go ahead and disagree with you there. I didn't think that one was ugly. I thought it was something different and something kind of creative. So I'm not going to agree with the ugliness, although I understand that that's the one people might anticipate me wearing for this. I'm not a huge fan of word marks, but I will say this. This color of blue is absolutely fantastic. And if they had a third jersey that was this color of blue with their primary logo on the front, I think you've got an automatic winner. Maybe not with the stripes like this, though. The stripes are kind of odd, and then you've got the black on this side that breaks up the stripes, and it's weird. But anyways, there you go. The low points of the Colorado Avalanche, which have not been as bad as Quebec's, and both of them are included here. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for all your support and for watching. I will talk to you again soon.